The latch made a small iron click behind me, and in the quiet room it sounded louder than it should have. I remember the lamp flame leaning inside the glass chimney. I remember the smell of fresh pine boards and starch from the quilt, and I remember my wife standing beside the bed with both hands closed around the edge of her apron, trembling so hard that the fabric moved between her fingers. At first I thought she was cold. Then she looked at me and I understood that she was afraid. What troubled me most was not only the fear in her face, it was what she said when I asked her about it. My mother told me this is normal. My name is Jonas. I am an Amish husband, a father, and the head of a household. I have spent many years learning how to lead without crushing the people inside it. I share these stories because from the outside, our life can look simple. From the inside, it is made of choices, and some of those choices follow a man for the rest of his life. As you listen, I would like you to think about what trust should look like at the beginning of a marriage. We had been married only a few hours. The wedding meal was still sitting heavy in me. There had been roast chicken, mashed potatoes, brown gravy, pickled beets, bread, and more pie than anyone needed. The house had been full since before sunrise. Benches had scraped across the floor. Children had run between the kitchen and the washroom until their mothers caught them by the sleeves. Men stood in small groups near the barn, talking about weather, harness leather, and the price of seed as though this were any other day. But it was not any other day for me. I was 32, she was 27. We were both adults, and neither of us had been pushed into the marriage. We had spoken many times during our courtship, though never alone for long, and never about the things that waited behind a closed bedroom door. In our community, some matters are left unspoken because people believe modesty will protect what is sacred. Sometimes silence protects. Sometimes it leaves fear with too much room to grow. By the time the last wagon pulled away, the November sky had gone black. Frost was beginning to silver the fence rails. My younger brother had carried our small trunk upstairs, laughed once under his breath, and left before I could tell him to mind his own business. Downstairs, my mother and two of my sisters washed the final dishes. I could hear plates touching in the basin and the low murmur of their voices. My wife and I climbed the stairs together. The room had been prepared for us in the farmhouse, where we would live through our first winter. There was a double bed, a washstand, one straight-back chair, and a wooden peg for my coat. A small kerosene lamp stood on the dresser. Someone had placed a folded white towel beside the basin and a sprig of dried lavender on the windowsill. I closed the door because that is what a man does when he enters his bedroom. The latch clicked. She flinched. Not a small movement. Her shoulders came up and one foot moved back until her heel touched the bed frame. I took off my hat and set it on the chair. She watched my hands as though every motion carried a meaning I did not understand. I asked, "Are you all right?" She nodded too quickly. I asked again. That was when I saw the trembling in her hands. There are moments when a husband can protect his pride, or he can protect his wife. He rarely gets to do both. I had imagined that evening in the way many young men do. I expected nervousness. I expected awkwardness. I even expected laughter because the two of us had laughed together many times before. What I had not imagined was standing 6 feet from my new wife and feeling that she saw me as a danger. So I did the only sensible thing I could think to do. I stepped back. I sat on the straight back chair. I kept my hands where she could see them, resting on my knees. Then I said, "Nothing has to happen tonight." She stared at me. I could hear the lamp making a faint hiss. Somewhere beneath us, a chair leg dragged across the kitchen floor. The house smelled of soap, wood smoke, and the cold air that had followed us upstairs. She said, "But we are married now." I told her I knew that. She said her mother had warned her that a wife might be frightened and that she should obey her husband anyway. She had been told that trembling was normal, that tears were normal, and that the best thing was to endure the first night quietly because every married woman had done the same. I sat there listening, and with each sentence I felt something inside me turn heavy. Her mother was not a cruel woman. I knew her well enough to say that. She worked harder than most men I knew. She had raised 9 children, buried one in infancy, and carried herself with a faith that never needed to announce itself. I do not believe she meant to terrify her daughter, but fear can be handed down by people who believe they are giving wisdom. My wife finally looked toward the window and said one sentence I have never forgotten. I did not know whether I was allowed to say no. That was the whole matter. Not the wedding, not the closed door, not the bed behind her. She did not know whether her own voice still belonged to her. I wish I could tell you I answered with perfect wisdom. I did not. I was embarrassed. I was angry, though not at her. I felt cheated of the warmth I had expected from that night, and then I felt ashamed for thinking about myself at all. A man can feel 2 things at once. The question is, which one he obeys. I told her, "You are allowed to tell me no." She began to cry then, but not loudly. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed the heel of her hand beneath one eye. I stayed in the chair. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Eventually, I asked whether she wanted the door open. She nodded. I lifted the latch and opened it 3 inches. Warm light from the hallway lay across the floorboards. It was a strange thing for a wedding night, leaving the door partly open in a house still occupied by family, but it gave her room to breathe. We talked until the lamp was nearly empty. Not about anything romantic. We talked about the day. We counted the pies that had been served. We laughed about my brother dropping a spoon into the gravy bowl. She told me her feet hurt from standing in new shoes. I told her the collar of my shirt had scratched my neck since morning. Little ordinary things. That is how trust often begins, not with a grand promise, with one ordinary truth followed by another. Near midnight, I carried a quilt downstairs and slept on the settle in the front room. My father found me there before dawn. He did not ask many questions. He stood by the stove in his socks, added 2 pieces of wood, and looked at me for a while. Then he said, "A frightened person cannot hear love clearly." That was all. He poured water into the coffee pot and left me with those words. The next morning, I was worried about what my wife would think when she woke. I worried she might feel rejected. I worried our families would notice. I worried that I had already failed at being a husband because I had no clear idea what a husband was supposed to do next. But when I went upstairs, she was sitting beside the window, fully dressed, braiding her hair. The frost on the glass had begun to melt in thin paths. She looked tired, but she was no longer trembling. I asked whether she wanted breakfast. She said yes. So we went downstairs together. For the first weeks of our marriage, I made a point of asking before assuming. I asked whether she wanted me to sit beside her. I asked whether she wanted the lamp left burning. I asked whether she wanted the door latched. At first, every question seemed to surprise her. Then, slowly, she began to answer without looking at the floor. Trust did not arrive all at once. It came in small measurements, a hand placed in mine during an evening walk, her head resting against my shoulder after a long day. The first time she laughed when I kissed her forehead because my beard scratched her skin. The first time she reached for me instead of waiting for me to move. Months later, she told me that the night I slept downstairs had changed the way she saw marriage. She had expected that becoming a wife meant surrendering every boundary she had. Instead, she learned that a good marriage gave both people a place to speak honestly. I learned something too. I had entered marriage thinking leadership meant carrying responsibility, making decisions, providing food, keeping the roof sound, and standing between my family and hardship. All of that matters. But leadership also means knowing when not to take what your position makes easy to demand. A husband can be obeyed and still be untrusted. He can be in control and still be alone. I did not want that kind of marriage. There are people who hear a story like this and think it proves that every traditional community is cruel. That is not what I am saying. I have seen tenderness in Amish marriages that lasted 60 years. I have watched old men warm their wives' gloves beside the stove before church. I have watched women sit beside sick husbands through entire nights without complaint. But no community is protected from harmful ideas simply because it values faith and family. Sometimes an idea survives because nobody says it aloud. Sometimes a mother passes fear to a daughter because fear was all she was given. Sometimes a man mistakes silence for agreement because silence is convenient for him. That is why this story still matters to me. My wife and I have been married many years now. We have children old enough to ask serious questions about courtship and marriage. When those questions come, we do not give them every private detail. Modesty still has value. But we do not teach them that fear is a duty. We tell our sons that strength without gentleness becomes selfishness. We tell our daughters that marriage does not erase their voice. And we tell all of them that love should never need terror to make itself obeyed. When I think back to that room, I still hear the latch. I still see the lamp flame and her hands around the apron. For years, I wished the beginning of our marriage had been different. Now I understand that the choice made in that room became part of the foundation beneath everything that followed. I did not earn her trust by closing the door as her husband. I began earning it when I opened the door again. That is the clearest thing I can give you from this story. A marriage is not made safe by vows alone. It becomes safe through the choices two people make after the vows, especially when one of them is afraid. If you value honest stories about Amish family life, faith, work, and the decisions that shape a household, you are welcome to subscribe. And I would like to ask you one question. What do you believe a husband or wife must do to make trust possible at the beginning of a marriage?